At some point, everyone struggles to mix snare drums. We've all spent hours just trying to mix that one single instrument. So let me share with you a 5-step approach that will make mixing your snare drums so much easier. Step 1. Listen and observe. Know what kind of song you're working with. Know what kind of goal you want out of your snare drum. The first step is setting that goal. What kind of record are you making? Do you want your snare to sound edgy? Do you want it to sound reverby? Do you want it to sound like a Stone Temple Pilots record or a metal song? Or are you going for something that's R&B? You need to know where you're going with the snare drum to know how to get there. All of this informs the decisions that you need to make when you're actually physically mixing the song. Also, listen to determine if there's any issues with your snare recording. Did you get it in and there's a weird bounce? Is there a rattle? Listen for things that you're going to have to take out. Step 2, repair. This is all about subtractive mixing. Let's take out the bad stuff and leave the good alone. Now that we've identified some of the problems and where we want this drum to go, we can start addressing it by removing those things that are not needed in this track. But before you start boosting things, we do want to remove what doesn't need to be there. Remove first what sounds bad, and we'll worry about boosting the things that sound fun here in a minute. One of the biggest aspects of repairing any snare drum is getting rid of a ring. The easiest way to do that, since it is a constant boom, boom, boom kind of note, is to use a bell filter. These will be on any parametric EQ that you have. You can even use the stock one if you'd like. And we're going to use a bell filter. Take that bell filter, and we are going to boost it right now, but we're boosting this only to be able to find what's bad. Boost that bell filter up and sweep it across the frequency spectrum until you find where that note is resonating. As you find that note, start narrowing that Q up until you find just that note. Now, before you start attenuating that resonant frequency, take your EQ level back to 0 and sit with that for a second. If you don't, you'll run the risk of accidentally EQing too much of that note out. That note is still part of the snare drum, it's still part of the sound. You just don't want it as present. So live with it at 0 gain, once again, for a little bit longer, and then start attenuating little by little. Sometimes 3 dB is all that you need. Sometimes you need a lot more than that. Another trick to find that frequency quickly is if your EQ has an RTA, or a real-time analyzer. What that does is it will show you a graph of the frequency response as the track is playing. Typically, resonant frequencies on the snare drum is the second peak that you're going to see on that RTA. First one will usually be your low pop and punch of the snare, and the second one is usually where that frequency will live if your snare has one. Another part of repair is if you have a rattle or some kind of other sound that's less tonal, meaning it's not based on a single frequency like the resonant note in a snare. Then try some compression. Your goal here is to compress just that little section that's going to have the problematic issues. We're also not compressing here for tone and smack. We're not doing creative compression here. We're not trying to package the deal. We're just, once again, trying to repair and get out the bad so we can leave the good. So set your attack and release times fast enough that it will capture the portion of the snare drum hit that's not good. Most snare drum transients live somewhere between 8 milliseconds and 12 milliseconds. And that ringing portion, the sustained portion of a snare drum, will last around 45 or 50 milliseconds. You might try starting in those places and then adjusting. Every snare drum is going to be different. Another important thing to remember at this point in time is you're probably not going to be using any makeup gain. You're simply just trying to remove what shouldn't be there. Step 3, frequency expression. Now this is the part where we start to have fun. We get to push things around with an EQ to make it sound tonally the way we are going to want it to in the end mix. Again, do you want it high and tight with kind of the crack of the stick, or do you want it kind of low and boomy and kind of a fat snare drum? That again is going to inform the decision you make right now when you're EQing your snare. For a thicker snare, something that you want a lot of low-end punch to, perhaps you are doing more of a Stone Temple Pilots record where you want a lot of boom, boom kind of sound coming out of your snare drum. You're going to want to push up the fundamental range of that snare. Again, every snare will be different, but a lot of those will live anywhere from, say, the 300 to 500 hertz. Some are lower, some are higher. Push up that first fundamental note just a little bit with a nice broad Q. It'll give it a little bit of that that low-end rumble, a little bit of that thickness to your snare that you might be looking for. But be careful when you push up this area, because this area also contains a lot of what we call mud. It's going to sound kind of garbled and kind of closed off if you're not careful. So be very aware and very specific when you push up frequencies in that range. If you want a snare that has a lot of that high, tight crack to it of the stick, you might try pushing things up around the 1 kilohertz, the 3 kilohertz range, or maybe even all the way up to the 8 kilohertz, just a little bit. Be careful, though, around the 3 kilohertz range, as that's where our ears are most sensitive, so it's going to perhaps be a little more piercing, which maybe is what you want, but just don't overdo it. These common frequencies help, but don't overdo any frequency moves. Small adjustments are your friends. Small adjustments will go a lot further, especially once we start compression. Step 4, compress for character and presence. This is where we get to add the aggression to your snare drum. You want that thing to really sound thunderous and big and boomy? Do you really want it to crack really tight like it's straight from a metal piece? Then compression is going to be your friend. The first step in this is choosing the right compressor to match the sound you're going for. Do you want it tighter and more punchy and more aggressive? Then perhaps choose a compressor like the 1176. If you want your snare to be more mellow and more subdued in the mix, then perhaps you choose something that's a tube modeler or an optical compressor modeler. That will serve you a little bit better as they're a little more mellow pushing forward. In this stage, attack and release times are everything. Your attack and your release decide what you are going to compress, whereas your ratio and your threshold are going to adjust how aggressive you're going to have that compression kick in. So again, your attack and release control what you want to compress, where your ratio and threshold control how much. I know this may feel opposite, but you're going to want to compress the parts of the snare you don't want to accentuate while letting pass through the parts you do like. So if you want a really aggressive snare, you're probably going to want to compress the sustain portion of the snare and not the transient. Whereas if you want a more mellow snare and something that has a big sustain to it, you're going to want to compress the transient and not the sustain. That's done by setting your attack and release times appropriately. Once you have your attack and release times dialed in, make sure that you adjust your ratio and your threshold a little bit more to make sure that you're not taking too much off the top. Really, you only want to get around 6 dB of compression per compressor. You don't want to go too awful much more, as you'll start to introduce distortions that may not be good. However, you can compress it less than 6 dB and be just fine. Now that we have a couple dB of compression on your snare drum, it's time to turn that makeup gain up and just level match what you hear coming in to what you hear coming out. Your compressor's not really there to shape the sound level, it's there to shape the sound's tone. If you've got this far and you have a snare that you've mixed and you like it, good. If you don't like it, that's okay too, because mixing in the box is so forgiving. We have the chance to go back and readdress everything at every step. Remember, mixing is an iterative process, so you're going to be going back constantly and rechanging things that you've already done to match and fit the new settings of other things that you've added to the chain. Also, as you go through this, you're going to want to make sure that you keep checking your snare drum with your overall mix. You don't want to be making all of these decisions in solo, because we're never going to be listening to this in solo. What matters is how it sounds compared to the rest of the song and the rest of the mix. Finally, step 5, the fun stuff. If you've made it to this point and you have a snare drum that sounds fantastic, make sure that you let me know in the comments. But here's step 5, the fun things that we can do to add just a little bit more sparkle to an already great sounding snare. My 2 favorite things that you can do that just add a little extra life to any kind of mix is saturation and reverb. Now hold on, I thought reverb was for vocals and guitars and such. Well, it can be, and that's a great use. But adding a reverb to a snare is also a lot of fun. Try routing a snare out to some reverb and just hear how it explodes in space all of a sudden and adds an ambiance that you might not have expected to have been there. Saturation and distortion of the right kinds can sound amazing. Try pulling up different plugins that have saturators and distortions built in, because each of those is going to sound slightly different and emphasize different harmonic overtones inside your snare. I personally, for drums, really like the newfangled audio, but also something as simple as lo-fi with 0.01, 0.02 on the distortion side can really add a lot. With these 5 steps, you can take just about any snare drum into being not only a usable part of your track, but something that you like and love and didn't spend 10 hours trying to mix. If this helped you, make sure that you let me know. Make sure that you hit that like, hit that subscribe, and drop a comment below. I would love to hear about your success mixing snare drums.